Okay, so I think my talk probably follows on from Paul's quite nicely. I'm going to talk about, although it's different in the sense that I'm interested in what we should do in the future and what, how we can evaluate pharmaceuticalisation for the future. But it's very much about asking the question, what can we learn from the past? And I'm really just going to pick out a few challenges here from a huge amount of research that I and some colleagues have been doing on a whole range of aspects: regulation of innovative pharmaceuticals, drug safety, international regulatory standards and so on, which has been going on for many years, principally at Sussex actually, but more recently at King's College London. So first of all, a lot of what I want to talk about, I suppose, is the relationship between politics, economic interests, and these processes that a lot of people are talking about: innovation and public health and innovation systems and so on. So this is a graph that just shows the increased dependence of regulatory agencies on industry fees. You can see an increase here from 1994, 20% up to 60% in case you have to 70+% in the case of the European Medicines Agency, as it's now called, and in the UK it's about 100%. But this is very crude, and really what this is an indicator of is a shift in the political culture and the relationship between regulatory agencies and the industry it's regulating. That is to say that the relationship has become a lot closer, and regulatory agencies have become more inclined to pay attention to the interests of the industry. We also have this thing called ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization of Drug Registration Standards, which is an attempt to harmonize regulatory standards across the European Union, the US and Japan. But the WHO's worked to extend its standards out into so-called developing countries and so on. These are just a few examples of things that the ICH did from 1990. So in terms of the requirement on firms to give expedited reporting of adverse drug reactions, it didn't require them any longer to report expected serious adverse drug reactions in an expedited manner. This would mean, for example, a drug that goes on the market, hits a huge market like Viagra in 6 weeks, a huge number of people taking it in 6 weeks, that there wouldn't necessarily be any need to expedite adverse drug reactions if they had been seen in the clinical trials, which means they're expected. Long-term exposure standards are reduced from 1 year to just 6 months. This is for clinical trials pre-marketing. Can't go into all the various reductions that were made to animal toxicity testing, but there was definitely a loosening and lowering of standards there. This would include carcinogenicity testing, moving from 2 long lifespan studies to just 1, instead of 2 species being required, just 1 species. And as I say, these standards then go out beyond those 3 areas: Japan, US and Europe. So there's a loosening of standards here in terms of what's expected of the industry to get drugs onto the market and what's reported.
John, can you just clarify, does that apply to trials as well, or just...
Which?
If you go back to that slide, could you go back a slide? The long-term exposure standard, what does that actually apply to?
Sorry, that's clinical trials, yeah.
That applies to clinical trials?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I thought I set up and maybe I didn't. Okay, so we also see reduction or limitations in pre-approval evidence in terms of the use of surrogate measures of efficacy for new drugs. These can be established surrogate measures, such as things like blood glucose control being used as a surrogate measure of the efficacy to reduce things like heart attack and stroke and diabetes. Or it can be non-established surrogate measures, as they're known, which would be things like tumour shrinkage as measures of the efficacy of a cancer drug to increase survival. So one of the reasons why surrogate measures are used is because they can be used to accelerate the approval of the drug onto the market, so they can be done in a shorter period of time, but in the case of diabetes, a lot shorter period of time. But the difficulty with these surrogate measures is that they're not telling us necessarily what we need to know. They're not telling us about whether the numbers of strokes are reducing, or they're not telling us whether people are actually surviving longer in the case of cancer. So these are lower standards of evidence to demonstrate the efficacy of the drug. But this has been, the use of these has been increased since around the late 1980s. One of the ways in which regulatory authorities have compensated for this, supposedly, is that they then require the drug companies to do what are called post-marketing confirmatory studies. So they do post-marketing studies to confirm that the surrogate measure does in fact demonstrate some real clinical efficacy. And before I read out some of these problems of post-marketing confirmatory studies, I'll just say that, emphasize what Jerry said in the middle of his talk, which is how messy it is once drugs get onto the market, how messy it is to deal with all the problems once they're out there in the market. So it's a very significant development, this, within North America and Europe particularly, to have a shift of regulatory systems and standards in which lots of things are pushed to the post-marketing phase. So we confirm efficacy post-marketing, we reduce safety checks and so on, which I'll come to in a moment, deal with them in the post-marketing phase. We have risk management strategies. This is all post-market development. So, but anyway, post-marketing confirmatory studies. So in the 17 years that it was introduced by the FDA, in 17 years they hadn't withdrawn a single drug granted accelerated approval, even if the surrogate measure hadn't been demonstrated to be positive, indeed, including cases where it had been demonstrated to be negative. They've never withdrawn a drug granted accelerated approval based on non-established surrogate markers of clinical efficacy, even when the post-marketing confirmatory study hasn't been done for up to 13 years. Only 25% of cancer drugs, for example, which have been put on the market by using these surrogate measures, had actually conducted the post-marketing confirmatory studies. 65% of the post-marketing confirmatory studies never completed for cancer drugs, and 60% completed for cancer drugs took over 5 years from the approval time. So what we're seeing here then is a lot of drugs getting on the market which are on the market for a very, very long time just based on surrogate measures of efficacy. And this makes it very difficult to know whether they're as effective or more effective than other drugs in the market. So it has lots of knock-on effects in terms of what happens in the markets. The wider context of this is that we've also seen massive cuts in the review times that regulatory agencies are expected to review drugs. Cuts by about half since the mid-90s in both North America and Europe. And another thing that we've seen is an increase in patient advocacy organisations for accelerated approval of new drugs or innovative pharmaceuticals. But whilst that has happened, we've also seen something that muddies the waters and makes it quite difficult sociologically and politically to interpret, and that is the increased amount of funding of patient advocacy organisations by pharmaceutical companies. Now, a lot of this accelerated approval and all these measures that I've discussed, which have given us less evidence about the efficacy of new drugs, was meant to harness and release more innovation and more drugs that offer therapeutic advance. So if we look at some of the outcomes, we actually see that during this period, innovation fell. Sorry, I should have said, this is the world market, this is the US, but we're seeing declines. And then most important of all, we see that not only was there a decline in innovations during this period, but there's also a decline in the drugs that offer significant therapeutic advance. And these are known as priority new molecular entities by the FDA. And you can see that they have also declined. And I suppose from a public health point of view, they're the most important. It has to also be said though, that we've looked at quite a number of these drugs that the FDA has defined as offering significant therapeutic advance, and they don't actually offer significant therapeutic advance. So the number is even smaller here than we see with the FDA. Okay. That's also, so some other work we've done is to look at drug safety outcomes, to look at the number of drug safety withdrawals over time. And what you see, in fact, is that in North America and quite a bit of Europe, well, it's just limited to the US for time purposes, that basically drug safety withdrawals have increased very considerably since 1992, approximately doubled. But also, perhaps more importantly, that unsafe drugs are left on the market longer than they were previously. Subsequently, that have just been withdrawn from the market. Now they're left on the market and so-called risk managed. So they're all changes to the label, educational packages for patients, all these things are introduced to try and risk manage the drug, protecting the market. Risk management. I went to a conference very naively quite some years ago, thinking risk management was, this conference was going to be about managing the risk to patients, but then I quickly realised it was about managing the risk to the drug product. So increased use of risk management in order to avoid withdrawal, keeping the drug on the market for a very significant period of time. We've looked at the details of this, and what you really do with risk management is you reduce exposure, but you don't reduce the risks to the people who are exposed.
What do you mean by unsafe drugs? Can you give a definition when you say they're left on the market?
Oh, okay.
How did
so,
you define that?
The thing is, I've got so little time. Can I take my questions at the end?
Yeah, so
otherwise,
there's a clarification.
Yeah, I know. Just so little time. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So let me just say something about this then. Yeah. So drug safety outcomes. So what this means is that we're getting more drugs that are left on the market rather than being withdrawn, but we're also seeing an increase in safety withdrawals. And that's not a paradox, because actually if you were to apply previous standards of drug safety withdrawal to the more recent period, you would see the drug safety withdrawals actually go up further. It's because they're being risk managed on the market that it's lower. So in fact, really, you're seeing more than a doubling in drug safety withdrawals if you were to apply previous standards. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say something about, in this period, I mean, I take a point about CNS drugs going into decline recently, but in this longer period since around 1990, you see an increase in research and development for things like cancer drugs and antidepressants, but we also see a marked decline in sort of antibiotic development. And in terms of pharmaceuticalisation, I just want to make the point here that, so the market is shaping the priorities of what kind of drugs gets developed. So the regulatory system, you know, as currently defined, can't and doesn't shape what sort of drugs we actually get developed adequately, because there is clearly a public health need for antibiotics. Okay, so finally, just to sum up, and this is clearly an inadequate account of many years of work, but basically what we see is a trend towards fewer drugs offering significant therapeutic advance, including neglect of important therapeutic areas, but presenting more safety problems which are increasingly risked, that is to say risk management, less pre-market checks on toxicity or efficacy. And what I want to say basically is that it's not, I don't think it's adequate to talk about this in terms of things like innovation systems and new technological features and all the rest of it. That's important. But actually, what you've really got to talk about here is what's the sort of political system that has been present during this story of failure. And the political system has been increasingly one of neoliberalism and what I also call corporate bias. Corporate bias, which is a bias involving the state and the industry prioritising their particular interests within a neoliberal political terrain. And you know, we need to talk about this fundamental political stuff if we're going to really get to grips with what's been happening, learn the right lessons and move forward in an intelligent way. That's it.